I'm the Executive Director, North America of Quilliam. And Quilliam is a counter-extremism organization. So we are in America, which is a good thing. And I've been with Quilliam for a year, over 2 years, in April. After 12 years with U.S. government, I was in the intelligence community. I was a senior analyst working counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism issues, working specifically at the National Counterterrorism Center. So I was tracking, actually, very interesting enough, the work of Quilliam, writing presidential daily briefs about how do you come up with effective de-radicalization program, how do you deal with the issue of Islam, how do you deal with the issue of reform, if you will, renewal, revivalism, however you want to frame it. And so for the past 2 years, we have been engaging really three-pronged approaches, at least out of the U.S. One, we do policy and analysis. We are working on cutting-edge issues from the range of the spectrum of extremism issues, ranging from the Islamist threat to the far right, and other extremisms more broadly. We run our mouth on TV and we provide analysis on that. And we work on programs and interventions. We are working with well over a dozen individuals just in the United States alone who we've been working on rehabilitating, former Al-Qaeda, former ISIS, presently. In the next 2 weeks, finally, after a long, dragged-out Vice News documentary, we finally are about to publish a documentary on Mohammed Hassan Khalid, who is the youngest person in U.S. history, where I personally have rehabilitated and de-radicalized. And we have others who are coming down the pipeline. I can tell you they're at different stages. Some individuals are ready to go and they would love to be integrated back into society. Others are still on the cusp. They are struggling to find their place outside of extremism. And it's a slow, long journey. I mean, Majid Nawaz's story, as you saw, is a slow journey. Noman bin Nutman, who is our president, it's a slow journey. It was a slow journey for him, and others too as well. So Mohammed Hassan Khalid's story, the youngest person, 15, we work with, and we have a number of others that we have been tasked to, not just domestically, but we've been in Nigeria, we're in Somalia, we're in Iraq, Central Asia, where we're working on this issue. And last thing I'll say, I'm giving you more than you probably asked for, but we offer one approach. We have a hell of an approach that we've engaged in for well over a decade, but we have one approach. And we say that we offer good practices that can be effective, but they're not best practices because we've already solved the issue. So I think we've been sort of on the cutting edge issue on that in a very nuanced fashion. And we deal with, and last thing I'll say, we deal with the issue of confronting the issue of working within the tradition of Islam. That's sort of something that I think is important to highlight. We work with our partners and friends who we don't always agree with. I think it's okay. We work with individuals who are ex-Muslims, if you want to use that label. We have no problem with that. We just feel like it's important to work within the tradition of Islam. In the words of some of my colleagues earlier, the words of King Abdullah last year at Davos, Switzerland, he said there's a civil war going on within Islam. That there's something that has to be solved. There's something that has to be done. Lastly, I'll say President Abiy Ahmed, the president of Ethiopia, recently when he came to Washington, D.C., someone came to him, and Abiy Ahmed is a Pentecostal, he's Pentecostal by religious denomination, despite his name. Just shows you just the intermarriage and relationships, particularly in Ethiopian society. One of the princes in UAE came to him and said, hey, we want to teach you Islam. And he responded to him, he says, we don't need you to teach us Islam. We've been coexisting for centuries, and we were the first nation to offer refuge for the early Muslim community in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. He said, all we want to do is learn Arabic, and we want to create ways to coexist within our culture and our society and create an Ethiopian Islam that works alongside others who have no religion, those who are religious, and find a way for pluralism. And I think that's a perfect example of the work that we try to do, particularly in our Western liberal democracies, in creating a holistic way of how we can respect all.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a short bio of who you are, much shorter than that one, if you don't mind.
Okay.
'Cause I want
Well, actually, to bridge from what Mohammed was saying, this path of extremism and how difficult that is, how slow that is, that's kind of something I went through as well. I was never an extreme, I was a fundamentalist, and I was married to an Al-Qaeda member, but I myself was never involved in any terrorist activities or anything like that. But it's still that same process of, Majid talks about it in his book Radical, it's rebuilding yourself brick by brick, like looking at every brick and turning it over and figuring out, like, what is this? Do I want this to be a part of me or not? Because you grow up with one straight path and then that path is gone and you have to figure out who you are and start your life over from then. And it was actually Sam's famous episode with Bill Maher and Ben Affleck. That was the episode that made me feel like I wanted to get involved.
Well, let's just do the Q&A, and then my
Let's do it.
very brief thing was, I was, as a concerned outsider, didn't grow up in any of the traditional secular Jewish household in Pennsylvania, but since 9/11, I've been just quite concerned about losing the conversation and things going off the rails on all sides of the political spectrum. I was following Sam and his career and his frustration, and maybe echoing it in my own personal life, and I made the film just to sort of make my statement with it. And then reading the book between Majid and Sam obviously was super inspiring and challenging and educational for me, that I just wanted to amplify that particular conversation. So you just saw a lot of talking. What are your questions? Who wants to throw something at us with what you saw? Yeah.
I have a question for you. During your introduction, you said that you guys help de-radicalize people that have, Muslims, right? So how do you do that?
Good one. So, the approach, I would say, is individualized. In the case of, I'll give you a couple examples. In some instances, it is just individuals needing a mentor. They need a good counselor. That's all they need. They just needed a good friend. They needed someone to talk to, and they just were caught into sort of the groupthink effort. Other times, it is providing mental health support. So we have psychiatrists and psychologists now who we've worked with who are assisting in a formula that can be very tailored to reward that one individual, wherever she's from or he's from.
So we approach you.
So our referral process is a good question, it always comes up. We have received, a lot of our referrals they come from different ways. One come from family. Other referrals have come from law enforcement, where individuals who are right on the brink and they need assistance. Otherwise, they're gonna get locked up. What happens when an individual is incarcerated and when they come home, law enforcement is scared about them potentially going back into that same pathway. So they need to find some organization or entity potentially who could work with them. So we've offered that. We are in that role to do that. Lastly, I'll offer to say we have provided, and it is not the sole approach, ideological rehabilitation, theological rehabilitation. So you just heard just a few examples of what we've done, but that depends on the individual, because individuals' pathway and why they join the movement varies. I'll say two other examples, or two things that just happened recently. In the case of William Clark, actually recently, I was thinking about someone. Last month, he traveled to the so-called Islamic State, and he said he wanted to travel there just to see what it was about. That's it. If you watch the ABC News special that was done on him when he was being interviewed, he seemed very erratic, seemed very unstable. Christopher Clark, not William Clark, Christopher Clark. And there'll be some assistance that he will need, with clinical assistance. That's unique to him. Hoda Manthana, who we saw in the interview recently, or we've if you haven't been following The American Who Wants to Return Home, or Shalima Begum, who's in the United Kingdom, they both have seemed remorseful, but it could just be that they want to return home. So she said she wants to help in de-radicalization. Do I believe her or not? My question next is, one, I think another element is there's a gender bias of not thinking that women also have a leadership role that they play within the recruitment process and engagement down the radicalization pathway too as well. So if that's the situation, maybe directly we would engage in unpacking some theological, ideological viewpoints that might bring her back slowly from the brink.
To piggyback on it with because I get this a lot with the film, where people are like, oh, that's great, but like, that doesn't work for Muslims, right? Like, no one's gonna see this film and be like, oh, wow, like I was wrong about religion.
Yeah.
And I'm curious your thoughts on that, and then I have an anecdote to throw you, because it's a Harris Reed piece on the end of the film, anecdote, is I always emphasize when I get these questions, is like, for me also, like this film is much more about the subtitle than the first word. It's called Islam, the Future of Tolerance. It's much more, for me, about defining the future of tolerance and having the questions about what is liberalism, what is tolerance, et cetera. It's more for how do we talk about this problem again from the outside. But Harris Rafiq, maybe it was a hopeful story. It was around the time that we did his interview, and it's the largest Muslim youth group in the world from Indonesia had just put out a statement, like sort of admitting, like, oh, like we need to readdress the Quranic sort of interpretations for a 21st century morality. Take what you want from that. And Harris Rafiq sort of gave me this wink, wink, nod, nod that he literally handed this book to the head of that organization like a month before. So I don't know, is this kind of conversation effective for maybe not the de-radicalization of someone who's already gone and joined ISIS, but sort of an earlier prevention to not let it get to that point?
You know, I think Muslim community, there's no monolith. Muslims come in all shapes and sizes. Human beings come in all shapes and sizes. And I think one thing, good and bad, of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, any extremist group, what they have done is finally allowed a conversation within the American community, within Western communities, to confront the reality that we have to be much more surgical in our language. We must be much more articulate in how we see different groups. And so you're referring to Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia. And I think I think what is showcasing is that Muslims are wrestling through what it means to be Muslim. One of the best books I've read recently is called What is Islam by Shahid Ahmed. If you ever read it, it's a really good book. He passed away a few years ago. And he starts off the book and he says he was sitting at a dinner with another professor and someone leaned over to the other professor he was with and says, oh, why are you drinking wine? Muslims aren't supposed to drink wine, right? And so the other professor response was, I've been drinking wine because my grandfather drank wine and my father drank wine, and we've been Muslim for centuries. But I thought that was interesting, whether it's wine or not, it doesn't really matter. There's more of the point of, there's cultural Islam, there's also interpretation of how one sees Islam in the text. I was telling someone earlier that the U.S. Constitution is a 200-year-old document. Some see it in symbolic ways, some see it in a textual way, some see it in a literalist fashion. And I think Muslims are wrestling with that means. I think American Muslims are confronting that. Western Muslims, British Muslims sure as hell are confronting that. And whether you agree with the formula, or Muslim communities might not agree with the approach that what Pullingham does versus another organization does, what we're doing is creating that conversation.
I want to bring Yaz in, because I know like a lot of this particular, how far you stretch Sam does it in the film, where Majid's doing the dance that maybe you're doing. Because bringing the U.S. Constitution, Second Amendment, we argue about it all the time, what does it mean? But clearly it doesn't mean you have, you could bring a purple dragon into this thing. We're talking about, at some point, as Sam says, they're not infinitely elastic. It has to mean something. Maybe there's like a pointed question I never asked you. Yaz and I have talked about this stuff forever. The first challenge, maybe you could both answer, the first challenge that Sam ever gave to Majid, which happened here in New York on not far from here at that debate. Are you lying on that stage? Do you think? First of all, I actually don't know how Majid would answer it right now at this moment. I'm curious what you would say publicly or privately. But do you think Majid's basically lying on that stage?
I don't think he was lying on the stage, but I think that he was portraying a reality that existed in his mind and that he hoped would exist in the world. And I commend him for that. Like, I think it's a great project that he's doing. I applaud him for it. Not just Quilliam, but any reformers, or this, guy that said, I drink wine because my grandfather drank wine, all the power to him, or the other guy that said, this is our Ethiopian Islam. That's fantastic. I'm happy to see these conversations. I'm happy to see people not taking the religion literally, as the religion tells you to do. So I'm happy to see this cherry picking going on, but I come from a background where there was no cherry picking allowed, and the most Arab countries, Arab Muslim countries, are, it's like over 90% Muslim, Sunni Muslim, I guess Iran is a different case, but they also follow Sharia there too, right? And Islam is in the education, it's in the government, it's in the media, like there are no dissenting voices, there are no counter narratives. So everything that we're talking about here is really, it's all great to hear, but I think it's more realistic in the West. And hopefully one day it'll trickle and start to make a difference in Muslim majority countries. But they will first have to allow free speech. They will first have to allow free thought, and that's going to be the first step. Secularism, right? Separate mosque and state, and then we can have this conversation.
I'm sure there'll be a chance to respond, but let's take another Q&A. They're all related.
So, I've known Mohammed for a long time, and I originally worked in what they call the Ground Zero Mosque, which was the Park 51 project. It's supposed to be an interfaith center, but we kind of just got death threats. And I've done a lot of anti-ISIS research, and we've talked extensively about these things. There's two comments and a question. One is that there was a huge theological glossing over inside of this film, and a lot of stuff was watered down. The lobster metaphor, I just wanted to punch someone in the face. It was absolutely ridiculous.
I thought it was perfect.
Well, first of all, lobster's makruh, okay, which is... So I'm like, we're going to start with that. And makruh is makruh. For those of you who don't understand that, it's between halal and haram. It's like it's kind of like Jews that eat shellfish. But the big, I guess the bigger question is, and this is one I'm seeing. I just wrote about this for the Army Cyber Defense Review. This is one we're going to have, I think, for a long period of time, is that first we were talking about HUT and some of these defined Al-Qaeda, all of us have extended family that somehow has touched this kind of stuff. I had a bunch of relatives that fought for the Taliban, which was the Mujahideen when they started. The challenge that we have is that these defined terror groups are breaking down and they're moving towards what I call the laughing man, right? So it's decentralized, non-state actors. Just up at West Point, I just got a declassified document from them where they're talking about this stuff inside the military right now. And so I think the challenge that we're going to be faced as Muslims, and this is really where I want both of you guys to kind of speak to this, is the de-radicalization process, as you know, in Indonesia took like a decade, 2 decades. The stuff in Saudi Arabia that they've had ongoing for a long period of time can take up to 20 years. But what they do is they retrain these people and they reinsert them into society. The problem is with the ISIS and Al-Qaeda is that they basically were like the Rollins band or the Reagan youth of selling terror. They're like dead-ass punk rock, right? That's exactly where they are. And then what you have is these people that were promised all sorts of crazy things. Like take a gun and just shoot a whole bunch of people. And that you pull them out of that and you're trying to get them back into reality. That de-radicalization process, I think, is far more complicated. And then the second thing is the impacts of social media on top of this, right? Because, I mean, you and I talked about, there was an Instagram campaign called hashtag All Eyes on ISIS, okay, which was using a cat with a Kalashnikov to freaking recruit people. And so what we're dealing with is not the ideologies that we were talking about previously. We're dealing with like pop culture and meme idioms. And, you know, what are your thoughts on kind of like tackling that?
Yeah. You know, it's, Majid did something, he had an event recently, and he walked into the event with some Air Force Ones, and one of the Air Force Ones, right? And he had like a jalabia on, right? And he walked in and basically was just like, you have to stay adaptive. If you're not staying relevant, then someone else is staying relevant. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever, the far right, I have issues with that terminology, but those extreme white supremacist organizations, they're able to speak to an Islamic zeitgeist or a white supremacist zeitgeist in a fashion that others who are in government circles and putting together classified briefings or whatever aren't able to do. And so one of the things we have to constantly do is to stay adaptive and stay iterative to the times that we live in, that unfortunately, you know, there's money behind it. The UN says, hey, we want to support counter alternative narratives, and there isn't sort of, I would say, the innovation that might lead us to the way to really get this job done. I'm a little, you know, I used to be pretty, I would say that I'm an eternal optimist. I think that we are in a stalemate at this moment. Because what's coming next is, well, I would say this, before I say what's coming next, the Islamic State has already been achieved. You've already got a caliphate. Raqqa has already been achieved. Maiduguri with Boko Haram has already achieved as their Boko Haram's Islamic State. What's next? What do you do? What thrill do you do? This is the question. You expand? So these are the questions that keep me up at night, because to me, that's where we really should be thinking about next. We've already burned people alive. Qasasbeh, the Jordanian pilot, was killed over ISIS territories, burned alive. What else can you do? So I think to your point, I'm in agreement. You know, I think that these are, you know, I'm trying to blue sky all the time with my team to find out, like, what can we really come up with that's actually forward-leaning. We're still blue skying, right? And I think that's okay to say that, because we're trying to find, we're collaborating with all sorts of people to find ways in which we can, that we're not just using the same approach that we did 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, that we're constantly shifting. That's what I would say for now. I wouldn't disagree with any. The Saudis have already come up with a model. Our Haas has come up with a model, heading off to Copenhagen on Sunday. And, you know, that model has already been achieved.
Actually, I'm going to throw this to you, but like, to defend the lobster metaphor, if I can, for a minute. Like, what becomes so difficult in a lot of these conversations, and we've done a lot of these Q&As and stuff now, is I'm not sure in the film or in this conversation who or what is. I made it, and I don't know who the best target audience is. Mm-hmm. I met with Majid before we even started the film, and this was our question. He was like, "Who should we make this for?" Without hesitation, his answer was the left and the West. That, like, this is not a movie for Muslims. This is not a conversation with Muslims, which is interesting. He was like, this is for confused white people who have no idea, who might confuse you with Al-Qaeda. Like, it's about...
Different beer.
But people have no idea in Iowa, like, that you're not the bad guy. And that's who this is for, is like, how do you talk about this thing? And so when you dig down into like what's effective about extremism, you start talking about Al-Qaeda and this, like, I have no idea where the lobster metaphor splinters or not. Where I think it's, and I'm curious your thoughts on the lobster metaphor, is what that's supposed to do there, and is a psychological sort of speculative metaphor of, you have to onboard that there's a recipe book that's going to get you to heaven, and what it says in the recipe book and how you interpret it matters. That's what Sam's trying to do there. If you reject that as something that's non-existent, then it's a different conversation. But I think you have maybe direct experience of, like, yeah, there's a recipe book, and if you change the recipe, it changes the nature of the output of it. I mean, I don't know how much you want to talk about the marriage or what that, but I know the sort of strict
Yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are raised the same way I was raised, which is I mean, Quran tells you this, that you cannot change one single letter. This is the final word of Allah. You know, nothing is going to come after this. It's the best recipe for all people, for all time. So there's no questioning it, et cetera,
And
right?
Sam's metaphor there, it's like if this isn't real, it changes the nature of it. In that analogy, the lobster is paradise or whatever you're getting for it. And if it's not really a lobster, I mean, that's what he's trying to do there.
Yeah.
That would have changed your analysis. I mean, were you fully on board? You believed in the afterlife?
Oh, totally, yeah. Yeah, I was fully, I mean, it's black and white. You see, like, I think that when people come from a Christian background, the Bible is very metaphorical. It's full of all these little fables and stories, and people can interpret them however they want. Quran and Hadith are not like that. They're straightforward. There is room for some interpretation sometimes, but, you know, let's take, for example, the verse where Allah says, if you fear disobedience or arrogance from your wife, you know, first do this, then beat her. And so then scholars come forward and they're like, he doesn't really mean beat her. He actually just means like lightly, like with a toothbrush, don't leave a bruise, you know what I mean? So they start adding all of these elements to soften it up. And one of my favorite Egyptian atheists is in Germany. I forgot his name right now, I love him, but I forgot his name.
Hamid Abdul-Salam.
Yes, thank you. You read my mind, it was Hamid Abdul-Salam. He sort of gave the analogy of like Allah is the drunk guy at the bar. I'm sorry if I'm offending any Muslims right now. He's the drunk guy at the bar, and he's like, just beat her, man. And then his friends were like, no, don't. He didn't mean it that way. And that's basically what Majid and a lot of people are trying to do. And so of course I'm going to applaud that because I don't want them to listen to what is actually written in the book.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, because, you know, even within, at Quilliam, we have a range of individuals within the Islamic sphere. We have conservative, we have more liberal leaning, and we have those who are kind of in the middle, trying to figure it out. And I think that at least the framing, how we look at it is that, and I was saying this earlier, is that, you know, I think that there's cultural realities, there's religious interpretations that range. And so I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about uncle or auntie who's sitting at the mosque who might have a very conservative interpretation. But I don't know if that's the singular interpretation. But I would agree with you that the vast majority, or I would say a large segment of the Muslim community, the de facto form of Islam now in present day is a more conservative interpretation of Islam, which I would say is very different than the historical context of what Islam has been. 2/3 of the stars in this constellation have Arabic names. All the algebra, arithmetic, logic, etc. Something went wrong. So that's confronting the reality. I mean, we say this, that to say it has everything to do with Islam can't be the sole issue. To say that it has nothing to do with Islam can't be the problem either. There's somewhere in the middle. And that, to us, I mean, for us, that's really the sweet spot that we're trying to engage in, to say that this internal issue, this internal, like, dialogue that needs to take place. The same way that there's black on black crime within my African American communities that I have to address. It's not something pretty, but it's something that I have to address. So this is why we try to come, hopefully in a nuanced fashion, and say, yes, there's some problems within the Islamic tradition, and in our viewpoint, you will never get rid of all the conservative individuals. There has to be a way to inoculate and find some sweet spot where you can work with people, even if they are offering conservative viewpoints, and use that as a basis to then offer some changes.
We'll take another question, but it's a great question in that I think Majid tries to address it, or at least admits that it's maybe the fatal flaw, I don't know, when he does the, like, you're there's almost balancing animation of like when you're talking about human rights or gay rights, you're talking about this problem, or you're talking about extremism, you're talking about this problem. And he's like, you're sort of in this impossible place where Majid will tell you he needs to, in your, you have a different conversation here, different conversation here. Is that a fatal flaw in the language? I don't know. We could table that one, but I think Majid even points to like this might be impossible. Sam acknowledges like that might be impossible. Yes. So let's take another one.
So I might be your target audience.
Oh,
No, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and one of the most liberal, also one of the most white cities in the United States. So I just wonder, like, I'm trying to absorb what I just watched and taking that back. When I get a Ben Affleck type response, what are some of those bullet points? How I could propel the conversation to a more nuanced?
I'll answer first, but I'm curious to your guys, because like for me, like so my concern when I got involved in this was 9/11. So I'm going to use this analogy that I wrote in last night. Yuval Harari is one of my favorite writers. Wrote the book *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*. It's tremendous. He gives this great analogy of terrorism, saying terrorism. It's like if you imagine the bull in the china shop analogy. Terrorism is not the bull. The bull is more like a fly, which can't even knock over a single glass, but it gets in the ear of the bull and starts buzzing around, and the bull freaks out and destroys the china shop. We're the bull. American society, or whatever we've built in sort of a liberal, open society that frankly is functioning pretty well. We're the bull. We could lose that. We could freak out. So when 9/11 happened, and the concern was, we need tolerance. Don't freak out and kill all the Muslims. That's kind of what this conversation is about. The fear of that. So Ben Affleck's intentions are good there. I really think so. And those people who will yell at you in Portland, Oregon, their intentions are good. The argument is hopefully to get them to consider that possibly just their strategy, like you're on the same team, you're both concerned about the same thing there, but the strategy is just going to backfire because of what Mohammed just said, that it clearly is not, if you say this has nothing to do with Islam, if Barack Obama or even George W. Bush, they all said this, gets up after a terrorist attack and says, this has nothing to do with Islam is a religion of peace, chill out everybody. The maybe not so nuanced, educated farmer in Iowa hears that and sees right through it and says, this is a fucking lie. And then might just confuse the innocent girl wearing a hijab who lives next door for the bad guy, or, Harris Rafiq says it at the end. His fear is that Middle England wakes up tomorrow and says, you know what, fuck it, I'm done with Muslims, we have to fight Muslims, let's get them the hell out of here. Maybe Majid just experienced this kind of rise of sort of a far-right thing. So the intentions are good. If you could get to the strategy level of like, listen, that can't be true. But it doesn't have everything to do with Islam. It has something to do with Islam, and we have to be able to talk about that somehow. So I don't know, if you get in the door of that, you're on the same team here, and you just want to have sort of a strategic conversation of how you protect the minority, backlash that we all fear. There you go. I mean, and maybe Sam used to get this all the time, but he got this on that stage. His like takeaway line when he started writing The End of Faith was, if we fail to have this conversation, the right is going to have it for us, and we're probably not going to like how they do it. People used to just sort of laugh at him or scoff at him. No one's really denying that anymore. It seems to have become prophecy. So I think there's an opening, even in the Trump moment, there's an opening to be like, okay, we've reached that point. There's really not denying that the strategy, as intention as it was, just didn't work and isn't going to continue working. So let's try something else. And the other thing I like about the film and this conversation is, I hope it comes off that we don't claim to have the right answer. You said it just on the stage. Like, we're all trying to figure it out. This, like, what is the right thing to say here? And clearly, just on a pure strategic level, the like head in the sand, nothing to do with Islam thing, just total failure. That's good.
I know what the right thing to say is.
She's got it.
I have the answers.
Yeah.
What I do is I always compare it to some other fundamentalist religion. And then they're totally on board with agreeing with me. And then it's like, oh, and that also happens in Islam. So then they're already stuck. So if we're going to be talking about, women's issues,
The
for
Quran
example.
Bible outline that Majid uses. I find really
Yeah,
effective
yeah,
as
that
well.
is a really good example. Yeah. So if you talk about how women in fundamentalist communities, like Hasidic Jews, for example, how they have to wear the stockings, and they have to shave their head, and they have to wear a wig, and there's all this modesty culture and stuff like that. People will agree with you, like, yeah, that's terrible, that shouldn't happen. Be like, yeah, and Muslim women, they have to, some of them have to wear hijab, some of them even have to wear niqab. in the searing heat, and then they're like, yeah, like, you've already kind of made it a safe space that, and you're allowing them to see that your criticism is because you care about the human being. It's not because you are hating Jewish women or hating Muslim women. But if you start with talking about Muslims first, then the automatic assumption is like, uh-oh, I can't touch that with a 10-foot pole because she might be racist, so I can't agree with her. But, talk about Mormons first or something, and then
That would work in Portland.
Yeah, to your point about intent, I mean, I thought that for a long time as well. I'm starting to worry about the fact that the intent is more like a virtue signaling and it's not necessarily that sincere. So I always tend to want to think that, and I think that we always want to be, we target the left because we feel like there's a soft opening there, which is a positive thing. But I'm just concerned that it's actually not that sincere, unfortunately, and I feel like I'm part of the left. But anyway, two things. So number one, I just want to know, since you started this project, what you would do differently now 2 years after the fact or whatever the time is. And then also for Yasmin, my question is just, I see you waging a battle online often, with intersectionality, which is another front, because how do you get to the, hi by the way, how do you get to the, how do you get to that, to the battle that you want to get to eventually? You have to, the war rather, you have to get through other battle zones, one of which of course is the intersectionality. So first the question for you, and then also the question about intersectionality.
Fairly briefly, we filmed the first frame of this film, it was like October 2016, right before Trump got elected. When he got elected, so it was, to put it in, we had done all the Sam interviews, we hadn't done Majid's yet, and we all sort of emailed each other being like, all right, so what should we do with this? And we all sort of decided, let's not even address it at all in the film, because this conversation is bigger than Trump. It sort of just will be the background noise of whatever happens. But then there was also this open conversation in our email thread. None of us are fans of Trump, but we were all like, we don't actually know how he's going to handle this issue and talk about this issue because, and you guys could talk about it, we think the failure to have this conversation openly from anyone in the Democratic Party was a huge reason we ended up with Trump. He's a symptom of a cause that started a long time ago. So and 2 years later now, like I still don't know. I fear that he still owns the conversation on this, and that the left still, but there is an opening, as I was answering the last question, because you can turn Trump hatred into being like, yeah, we got to start talking about this, even if that's your lever to pull to get Trump out of office. Okay, fine, use whatever you can. But I'm with you on maybe the virtue signaling. But maybe you could still grab that virtue somehow and hijack it in a better cause.
Yeah, I agree with you on the virtue signaling too, but I think that there is the people on the far left, some of them obviously are just crazies, but most of them I think really are coming from a good place, like Ben Affleck, for example. I think that maybe he was, on steroids then. But I feel like if you could sit down and have a conversation with him, I mean, this is a guy that did a movie criticizing Christianity, right, where he in Dogma. So he'll understand, I think, if you're able to sit down and talk to him, and if you can get past this block that he has in his head that this is gross and racist to talk about this religion. But we can talk about this religion because they're predominantly white people. So that's the problem. And to me, I find that's racism, right? That's bigotry, low expectations. You're now, not wanting to touch this issue because of the color of the skin of the people that are practicing this religion. But I've had really positive interactions with people like Alyssa Milano, Sarah Silverman. I've been on CNN and BBC and Sky News, so I'm feeling like there is a change. I'm feeling like people are starting to get what Jay was saying about, the part of the reason why Trump was elected was because he was willing to name the problem that a lot of people were afraid of, but nobody else was willing to speak up. One example is somebody like Asra Nomani, who is a Muslim and she's, lifelong Democrat, yeah. But she was totally behind Trump because she felt like, well, at least he's addressing the problem, and to her, it's personal, right? Like, she lost her
Right.
friend. Danny Pearl was decapitated for being Jewish. So
But do
she.
you think, wasn't she just sending a message? She's not really that, I don't think she's really pro-Trump. I think she was just sending a
No,
message.
she's not anymore.
Us for Liz pro-Trump.
She
But
was very pro-Trump.
She was pro-Trump in the beginning, but it was for, it's that one issue. It was
Right.
that one issue, but it was
Yeah.
such a big issue. She's just one example. I'm sure there are other people as well that felt like, at least this guy is willing to name it. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is of people, but I know that it probably did contribute to him being elected. And I think a lot of people are starting to see that in general. Sorry, Jane.
No.
Just that first thing that Sam said about if we don't have the conversation, we're leaving it to the extremists to have the conversation. Most rational people are starting to recognize that that's actually the truth. And so that's why they're starting to speak
I was
up.
going to ask both of you this question that I've been thinking about a lot. To your question sort of about the virtue signaling, and in my thinking, like maybe there's a way to, virtue signaling only works when there's an audience that will click the like button and reward your virtue, then the signal actually is received and amplified. And I've been thinking a lot about, I've been reading a lot about breakthrough moments of different civil rights movements. Because I'm optimistic. I was saying this last night. I honestly think we're going to live and see the largest liberation of women in the history of humanity. It's mostly going to be in the Middle East. I'm actually optimistic as well. But there are going to be these breakthrough moments. And I've been reading a lot about Rosa Parks. I wrote a script actually totally differently about, I'm a huge baseball fan, about a baseball player named Josh Gibson. But there was always like, who was going to be the Jackie Robinson? And it becomes always this very maybe depressing psychological game of who's going to be Rosa Parks. She wasn't the first woman to do that. It was like a calculated decision for a lot of reasons that was successful in the end. And I've been thinking about Rahaf, a woman who, if you followed, who you helped get this visa, made a huge media splash. She happened to be an attractive young woman. There's like a lot of things that
She
are
wasn't planned with Rosa, though. She
was
not ready for that.
I know, but and I wonder if someone who works in counter extremism or what you're seeing here about these like breakthrough moments, how do we shift? How do you make it so the virtue signaling is just totally not returned because nobody's gonna like, it actually worked the other way where it's a virtue to champion Rahaf, where if some celebrity had been like, wow, like this is great, and then you just shift sort of the conformist nature of psychology to work in there. I don't think virtue signaling will ever go away. We just need to shift where the audience is. I mean, what do you find in your experience?
Well, actually, this gets to interpretation. Actually, there is, Muslim jurists have debated for centuries a lot of really real, minuscule topics that privately you would be shocked what they're talking about, but it never makes it out into the public. This is all historical, classical period stuff that clearly has no relevance to the present day. So historically, something's been going on. And I bring that up to say that there's an interpretive tradition that says that we should not see prophets. This is an Islamic interpretive tradition that said you should not see the prophets as singular people. This is getting to the Rosa Parks point. That the prophets themselves that came about, Moses, Aaron, Muhammad, whatever prophets that existed or didn't exist, just use that they should be seen as types of people that existed. Just how you, like, Jay is an awesome person, like, okay, Moses didn't live 1,000 years, he's just awesome, but the type of person who's Jay will live forever, right? I can agree with that. So I'm going to use that just Islamic interpretive tradition for a moment, right? Since I'm in kind of the Islamic reforming camp. To just say that I think you don't need a singular person. I think you need types of people out there who will radically change their society because one person will die. IBB, Faisal Al-Mutar, with Ideas Beyond Borders, has done a translation project and has put the ideas of Rosa Parks, Nelson Mandela, other visionaries out into the Arab and Muslim world. Great work. But that can't just be the single project. I think putting ideas and putting multiple people out there to radically change society is the solution, particularly in societies that are dependent on leaders to be their salvation. I think you need more sort of a movement that everyone can be part of this, and that's the real radical change. That's just from my estimation, because I think otherwise you see the fall of these societies. Sorry, I don't have much more to say on that.
Oh yeah, so I'd like to sort of bring the subject to like the radicalization of Muslim youth in Europe, and so I was like talking to like Faisal like a couple months ago about something similar, and the thing is like I don't know because when I see like because like I lived in like I guess like the hood, for lack of a better word, in Germany, and like most of the people in the hood over there like Turks and Arabs, and like I guess this is less of a problem with just like what I noticed is this is less of a problem with Turks than it is with Arabs. And like something I noticed was like just in general when it comes to the radicalization of like Muslim youth in Europe, it's sort of occurring in an environment where Islam's not the norm in a sense. So like, you know, a lot of these Muslim youth are dealing with external societal factors such as racism, such as poverty. And this is not in an environment in the Middle East, for example, where Islam is the norm. And I just wanted to have your thoughts on that.
It's happening everywhere. It also happens in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Iraq. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, I mean, in your experience, you saw youth being radicalized in Germany.
Well, no. I mean, I didn't really see youth being, it's less of a problem in Germany than it is, in my opinion, France, just based on what I've seen. People getting radicalized, like that tends to be big news, and like that was like one person in like my neighborhood or something like that, and that was like pretty much it. But like,
Is the question more about like
just
like
like one.
poverty, like how the external factors?
Yeah. Like what role do you think like these external factors play in terms of like the magnification of these radicalist sentiments?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I'll give like you can tell me like your anecdotes, but I think like almost in Majid's story where, I don't even remember the line in the film, but when he's getting chased by neo-Nazis in the street and seeing what's happening in, you know, in Eastern Europe at the time and sensing this and experiencing real racism, you know, it's almost this like, I'm going to become what they hate. There's almost this like, fuck you kind of response. I think that's a real psychological phenomenon that can lead you to radicalization, where you become the like, oh, they hate Muslims, they want to kill Muslims, I'm going to become like a super Muslim, and you find this like interpretation. I think that's a real phenomenon, so.
And the recruiters
yeah,
would use
they
whatever
use that.
tactic works.
Yeah.
So whatever, if you're a Shia in Saudi Arabia, they're gonna use that.
Right.
You're the minority and they treat you badly, so da-da-da. If you're in Britain, they're gonna use the white man, the Nazis tried to hit you with
Yeah.
clubs and
And
knives
as
or
far
whatever.
as, like, for another analogy, I don't remember where I heard this from, but like whether it's more true to say that you get angry from poverty or racism or whatever, and then you find an interpretation or a book, and then you become a problem of a radicalized Muslim or whatever you found, a radicalized whatever. If that's the way that the equation works, or it's the other way, that you find the book and it tells you to kill Jews and tells you to kill infidels, and then you do that thing and you become more angry. Whatever like sentence is more true for anyone, fine. It doesn't get us out of it doesn't get you out of the conversation that we still have to talk about where ideology and religion came, whether it was the chicken or the egg, doesn't matter. It's on the menu that we have to talk about. But in some of it was your question.
Just a few data points as well. The UNDP put out a study called Journey in and Out of Extremism. They canvassed roughly about 3,000 individuals. You can Google it, you can find more details about it. And 57% of the respondents said that they had little to no understanding of religion. Right? The perpetrators behind the Molenbeek attack, little to no understanding of religion. And in many instances, it was guilt. It was, hey, I was partying, living this life, and recruiters said, hey, you want to really vindicate yourself? Join this movement, and we can give you the sort of the blessings for it. Do it this way, star and a crescent instead of like the cross.
But then they use the religion at that point to emphasize why you should do it. See, look at, because it says here that you'll get the highest reward in heaven, and you'll get 72 virgins, and da-da-da-da. So they may not have been familiar with the religion beforehand, but the recruiters are, and they'll use it to their advantage.
If I could add to that point, I'm from Pakistan, and I've noticed two completely different spectrums where there's this one college over there that's fairly liberal, secular, and suddenly a lot of people there started becoming like radical Muslims, and because they were targeting them that way. However, on the other hand, I've also seen my like Islamic teacher, her son, who knew a fair amount about like the true teachings of like Islam and was, you know, he was pretty grounded in it, but he was taken away by like some terrorist group over there and then radicalized through that process. And their approach for both of them is just very, very different. And I think they catered it to that.
I want to ask a question to Mohammed. It's like, this came up a little bit last night of the toolbox for the reformer and all the things you can use. From an outside perspective, I'm really attracted to the historical tools that you can use, mentioning a little bit about tonight, like the Golden Age, Beit al-Hikmah.
Yeah.
So we mentioned Faisal and Discreet was calling it House of Wisdom 2.0. It's a reference to the era when, they named the stars and algebra and algorithm. These are all Arabic words, and this sort of proof that like it did it before, it can do it again. And other analogies like the Qadarites of sort of like the original ISIS, like that. Like we've seen this before, and Islam, without external intervention, squashed that problem at one point. So I don't know if you could talk about sort of how effective the historical tools of the reformer are, because I find from the outside those to be encouraging.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on. I think that for us, Dr. Usama Hassan, our head of Islamic Studies, put out a really good piece on in The Guardian talking about using Islamic scholarship to deprogram Shamima Begum. And he talks about the medieval classical period where there were, this isn't new. Like there have been individuals who've risen up and they needed to be stopped in terms of making sort of a fundamentalist, narrow, strict interpretation of Islam. So certainly I agree with that. Another thing, arts and culture. We had a play that was featured at Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, which was really exciting. I always tell people, it comes up oftentimes. I remember when I first joined Pulliam, everyone was like, who's this black American convert? I didn't convert. My grandparents converted to Islam back in the 50s. And they both educated. One was a jazz musician, came through Sufism. The other one was was skilled, basically Cosby version, happened to be Muslim, and comes from historically black college university as a professor. So, and was looking for spirituality. So I think that experience is interesting because it shows, different approaches to looking for spirituality rather than looking for some other ways to be. And I think that the diverse expression is important, and even music, So, we've collaborated, we'll be doing some more collaborations using hip hop and other musical genres that I think can really show people that, Muslims have been in the United States, have been in other locations, and offer a breadth of ways that we can live and coexist.
To throw a sand challenge, I think Yasmin would probably agree with, is I think the lines in the film of the worry is that historically, like it's that the exception of the rule, whatever it is, but whatever it is, like these interpretations, which some would argue are maybe attractive or the most literal or whatever it is, are always there to be discovered. And the worry of like it doesn't take much to read the book and say, wait a minute, it says we should cut the hands off of thieves. And so even if you have these long stretches where that is not like the accepted interpretation, like the danger, and this is not unique to Islam, but maybe more challenging with Islam, it's just always there to be rebooted. I don't know if that's a problem that we just have to onboard and accept because religion will never go away, but some people just aren't a fan of that. Line of reasoning, that might be one of them.
Yes. That's a much more broader explanation on it, but I agree. I think that it's a probably broader concept just on religion. That's stuff that.
I do think though that people, like if you just like average Muslim person, even my ex that was a member of Al Qaeda, I think had he been given the option, as opposed to saying this is the right way to heaven, this is the way to, if he had. Who knows? I don't know. But if when he was a teenager, instead, he was being told, like, you can still be a Muslim, but then you can also enjoy the world, like enjoy Earth as well. It doesn't always have to be about akhira, right? You can also enjoy dunya, right? The world, because Islam is all about like, you're supposed to just ignore life. This is just a stopover. Our real life is after death, right? And so that's why a lot of jihadis are happy to die, because this world is irrelevant. But I think that just your average human being, like I was talking about secularism, separating mosque and state, and I feel, some people disagree with me, but I do really feel that if you just give the average Muslim the opportunity to open their mind, to be free thinkers, they're not going to choose to be fundamentalists. It's not a happy life, especially for women. They will run for the hill. If you give them another option, they will take it. But the only option I was given was this or burn in hell for eternity. So, of course, you're going to accept all of these things because you don't want option B. But had somebody given me an option C, then, things would have been different. So although you're right, it always will go back down to it. I don't know if people will necessarily want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, everybody, just for doing what you guys do. I mean, I think you guys are all incredible, and having this conversation. So a little bit about what you were saying, Yasmin, about the option C, because I mean, I grew up, again, like as a Muslim, in a very, I was like in the Helvi Bora, is like a subsect of Shia Islam, and now it's becoming more in the media because the whole FGM stuff, and I'm starting to talk about that. I was just filmed a documentary actually with Huffington Post. But it's complicated because a bunch of things. I mean, one is I have to like walk, the tightrope I think was such a good analogy throughout, because even just now speaking out, which I've just been doing the past couple of years, it's hard because you want to criticize some of these ideas of Islam, but then when I started doing that, I started getting all these like stuff from like the alt-right people, like, oh yeah, that's great, like I was like, no, not right, like yeah, great, criticize, they're horrible and they're backward and we need to throw them out, and like, no, that, so there's that one thing, and then second of all, I think we've talked a lot about, talking to, white liberals and changing their mind and stuff, and that's a wonderful goal, and I'm glad that's, I think that, you're right, I think that's the film is sort of aiming towards that, but how do you talk to other Muslims? That's a little bit more, I mean, that's, for maybe that question, so like, what is the option C? Because when I was growing up, I had those two options, right, like, and it's right, Amanda, you can say something like, oh, like in our family, we've been drinking wine for years, and this is like for me, when I was growing up, I would have been like, you're not real Muslim. Like that's, you're like a sellout. You're like, we would have just laughed at you. Yes. So, like people that try to do that more secular kind of like, I mean, it's a hard place to be. And even me, like as somebody who's ex-Muslim, it's hard for me to talk out, because I feel like when I do that, I don't know if I'm isolating, people like that are actually Muslim, they're just like, oh, she's a sellout. We don't really want to listen to her. Because I kind of like, to be honest, when I was in that place, I kind of like would listen to people like Ayan, and I'd be like, oh yeah, she's like really bitter. She's had, some moments.
Yeah.
I can't take her seriously. So a couple of questions. What is that option C that you would say to other Muslims? How do you get them to be in that place? So for both of you, I would ask, how do you do that? How do you have that conversation? And then for Jay, just a question about, you were saying, like, as long as stuff is out there, the Quran is out there, people are going to take the text seriously. Have you read the Old Testament lately? That's still out there, right? And like, I don't know that we still have the fear that, one day Jews are going to be like, oh, like, we need to replicate what that guy was. Well, I mean, like Jews for the most part were able to sort of get over that. They were able to divorce, and all the Jewish people I have known, I have a bunch of friends who are Jewish. They're very like, they love the traditions and they're very secular and they are proud of being Jewish. But there's no fear of them going back to that. Is that?
I'll definitely.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I know it's about.
I'll just say, I mean, one thing we champion, I think third spaces are important for people to, outside of, you've probably heard of unmasked, there's a big movement taking place with people outside of the mosque circles where people can have free open conversations and dialogue. We have programs that we've done it in 4 countries in Africa, and we've done it 2 in Central Asia. It's called Tafakkur. It's a critical thinking program where we allow to think, to ponder, reflect in Arabic. So it uses that, but it also brings in the Socratic method, being able to co-construct ideas and doing it in a way where you're allowing for people to deal with community social issues. I think I think that's a good environment, regardless of the broad external conversation and the intra-Muslim conversation too as well, which is something that has to take place as well. So I think for us, that's an important, it's a safe space. We've seen success on that, and I think we'll continue with that. And I think that that's a good opening. It's not perfect, but it's a good opening for allowing that tough conversation that many people aren't willing to have.
I should see.
So for me, having grown up conservative, fundamentalist Muslim, I know what other women or what other Muslims are thinking that they wish they could do or they could change. And so I usually just generally address the issue, not the religion in general, but I'll talk about the issue. So with women, right now, like, this Free From Hijab movement that we have, there's 20 women, half of them are Muslim women from all over the world. And they're all women that, like women in Algeria or women in Iran or women in Saudi Arabia or women in the US or France or Canada that just want to be able to wear what they want to wear in the morning without, that being prescribed to them, for example. So as long as we're addressing that issue and working on that issue together, then we can be friends. But there are a lot of people, like there are even some feminists in Saudi Arabia that we'd be working together and then they realize, oh wait, you're an ex-Muslim? Okay, I gotta go. Like, end of conversation, right? And that happens a lot. So I am I'm not the best person to have that, to offer them that third space. That would be somebody like Muhammad, because I'm offering a fourth space, which is like complete freedom from the whole thing. And a lot of people aren't ready for that leap
it takes,
yet.
even me, it took me like 15 years, I think, I started questioning those things, and then I started going to like Sunni masjids, which were like, and then I started and I watched Letting Go of God, Julius Lee, if anybody's not seen that. Wonderful, wonderful book. But I don't think that we can go from here to there. So I think that these things are important. But I think your thing about just saying
Focus on the issue
focus
that
on
we're
the
all
issue.
concerned
And that's what I'm
about. Or
doing.
terrorism.
Yeah.
Muslims are more concerned about terrorism than anybody else because, like you mentioned, it's in our families, it's in our communities. When they poll, there's a Pew poll that talks to American Muslims, and it showed that they're more concerned about Islamic terrorism than your average American is. Because for the average American, it's not necessarily touching their life in the way that it touches the average Muslim person's life. So as long as we focus on the issues that we all want to solve together, then we can do that.
Could I add to just like 2 pieces here? So you in the back, you left. There was a conversation about intersectionality. We have our own intersectionality that no one's talking about because there's a racial hierarchy inside of Muslims. There's a cultural hierarchy inside of Muslims. There is a religious hierarchy inside of Muslims, and it's like this Rubik's Cube that you have to navigate most of the time. Like, we're mostly Saudi, but then I'm also Mughal. It's like one side of my family is like, you people are Muslim. And the other side of the family is like, sorry. And then this like goes on. This stuff, right? And
I was trying to wait to say all that, but you did it.
And on a regular basis, and you're going to hate what I'm about to say next. And so under Clinton, we didn't get anywhere. Under Bush, we didn't get anywhere. Under Obama, we got nowhere. Trump has put together a interreligious council, which Ambassador Brownback is running, right?
Yeah.
So I was on the first call this morning, and literally what they're doing, they're asking us, they're like, what are your problems? How do you want to solve this? And me and Gareth Bryant put forward the first issue. I was like, you guys need to help us facilitate intra-religious conversations, because I'll tell you this whole you're Dawadi Bora. I've met maybe like 5 Dawadi Bora, and outside of the whole
That's a
FGM
lot.
conversation, which I got involved, everyone here got involved in the FGM
Yeah,
conversation.
I mean, I'm really big in the
Right.
whole movement right now. I mean, like, you know, I was just here last week doing a panel here.
So yeah, I was with Shireen in America Matters and all that for like 2 years, and then that thing got agitated weirdly. But, you know, for us, I think what this really comes down to is that we need leadership from the top, which we're finally getting. We need the ability to facilitate these discussions on a national basis in between our communities. And to your point, the first Muslims in this country were black slaves. There are Muslims buried at ground zero. Okay, they found 20,000 bodies down there. And inside of this entire narrative that we have, the only two people that come up are the Southeast Asian person and the Arab person. No one brings the black American into this conversation, and they're 1/3 of the Muslim population. And until we start solving those issues, I mean, we're getting nowhere.
Now, you know, I went to Jummah prayers, Friday prayers today at the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, and I had never been. It was
Oh, I mean?
yeah, and I had never been, and and it was interesting because I don't always get to go on urban safari, but it was a very interesting conversation because it was the anniversary of Malcolm X's birthday, excuse me. And the Imam was talking about the need to have intra-Muslim conversation. So I just say that there is, I think, a slow conversation that is happening that's needed to take place, that's outside of the external dynamics going on too as well, that's happening simultaneously.
Should I answer the Jewish?
Yeah, I would love to hear you.
Yes, I grew up in a Jewish secular, just high holidays Jews, so you just go like once a year kind of thing. And I used to read the Old Testament while I was sitting there, and it's so crazy, of course. Like, I think Sam has even said it's by far the most barbaric of any of these.
Yeah,
Just like
I
a
mean-
pure, like, the God character in the Old Testament is just a raging psychopath.
Yeah, like it puts the Quran to shame. Like there's nothing,
that
you know.
guy is pretty brutal. Like, just killing the firstborn in Egypt, just like all of them for whatever. Anyway, just the flood. He was like pissed that the creation he made, so the flood comes. It's like all this crazy stuff. I'll ask a question. So I think, well, first of all, I'll say, of course, all of these books are potential.